I learned to use fashion and design and sculpture and art as a way to communicate when words could not translate the emotions. I think so much of my work is about world making. I think as a young girl, I felt this sense of absence of home.
The truth is that Solange Knowles has fought incessantly to find her identity, even as critics attempted to compare her to her big sister and musical legend Beyonce. Many didn't know how to categorize Solange. At the time of this recording, Knowles has 4 studio albums that include her 2016 groundbreaking album, A Seat at the Table, in which she earned a Grammy in 2017 for Best R&B Performance. And she has been ranked by Billboard as the 100th most successful dance artist of all time. Many who have labeled Solange as just Beyonce's little sister by now should be well aware of the boundaryless creativity that Knowles has exhibited. Knowles uses everything in her power to drive her vision with a sense of purpose. You know that quote that the magic is in the work that you're avoiding? Well, the story of Solange lies in the work that she immersed herself in. In this process, she found herself reinventing herself. She found herself discovering what to do with the nervous and doubtful energy, how to process grief, and how to channel anger in her work. She learned that her deficiencies and strengths are what led her to discovering her own magic. Knowles' human experience in its rawest form would come to be her foundation and guiding compass towards breaking the boundaries of what is expected of artists. And in this pursuit of what would define her work and her magic, she developed a mission to inspire all women, but especially Black women. Knowles' legacy at this point isn't defined at all by her family. I mean, it's the reference point to where her story starts. But Solange was determined not to make this the sole focus of her career and her art. Knowles has been determined to use her voice to advocate for Black people, Black artists, and Black culture in the name of advancement and preservation of life and art. Freedom is very important for most people, if not all, especially for artists like Solange. To not be restricted by money or perceptions, or even trapped by the illusion of perfection, is what leads to groundbreaking art, and it's what becomes the seed that will inspire future artists and generations to embark on their own path that feels right to them. When it comes to Solange, you will understand the importance from her of being in control of your own story and your voice. Many might not see the vision at first, but that's what makes for a fruitful journey. And through her projects, she uses perspective to push through her own limits. Solange says, whether it was through dance, poetry, or coming up with different projects, I guess I always felt a yearning to communicate. I had a lot of things to say. Solange has an impressive range of talents that includes songwriting, singing, composing, acting, and music production. Her resilience, strength, and mental fortitude have allowed her to persevere through family issues and even health complications. While her relatives aren't the sole focus of her story, we can all admit that her family pedigree has prepared her for a life of this magnitude. Solange was born in the 3rd Ward community of Houston, Texas, to parents Celestine and Beyonce and Matthew Knowles, who are both successful in their businesses and use their resources to ensure their kids have the best opportunity at success. Knowles was enrolled in singing and dancing classes along with her sister from a very young age, and she began crafting songs when she was only 10 years old. Solange spent a lot of her time in her own world, where she honed in on her future passions for fashion, songwriting, and music production. Knowles had a very active and constant creative and touring life as a child and young adult. She became a backup dancer for Destiny's Child when she was only 15, after a member of the group, Kelly Rowland, sustained an injury. And even at that age, Solange knew that she wanted to do her own thing and be her own person. She could have easily just joined Destiny's Child, but she declined even after her father suggested that she should. Though Solange always had admiration for her sister, I believe forming her own identity was priority for her. Knowles admits that she experienced a lot of loneliness in her teenage years due to the fact that she had such a rigorous touring schedule that consisted of being around adults and older people. She didn't have the opportunity to form bonds with people her own age. The effects of loneliness can do wonders for one's creativity, but it could also lead to mental health challenges. Solange's parents had an idea of the effects of a career in entertainment could have on their children, so they made the decision to take them to therapy to ensure that they were properly adjusting to fame, but most importantly, they wanted to ensure that their children had each other's back and were treating each other with kindness and empathy. In Solange's teenage years, She allowed the art she was inspired by to assist in how she processed her own emotions, and she utilized her interest in art to guide her through her most intimate and challenging moments. And she used fashion and art to express herself when words failed to. Her inspirations are very diverse and cover a lot of ground in artistic form and style. She describes being inspired by visual artists that she would see in the Rothko Chapel, and she lists Missy Elliott, Erykah Badu, Stevie Wonder, and Minnie Riperton as some of her musical influences. And over time, she learned to find a happy medium in her tone and how she wanted to convey her message. Solange has a very interesting journey. Even though she was the youngest of 5 in her household, her voice was always heard. Her ideas and creative pursuits were safeguarded and championed by her family, which became very important in shaping the world that she would eventually create. It gave Solange the confidence to strive for more. Solange comes from a very intuitive family, and from them she learned to trust her gut. For as long as she can remember, she says that growing up, her mother always taught her to be in control of her voice, her body, and her work. Knowles understands that a team is important and understands that women who appear obsessive with their crafts are looked at as control freaks, to which she says, "I do have a very distinctive, clear vision of how I want to present myself and my voice and my perspective, and who better to tell that story than yourself?" Solange's first opportunity at telling her own story within a complete body of work came with her debut album, Solo Star, in 2002. Knowles explained in an interview back in 2002 that the reasoning behind the title of the debut album was because she wanted to showcase her voice as the priority, and she felt the need to minimize as many voices that were heard on the album. The world at the time was expecting a Beyonce 2.0, and they were expecting a bunch of pop hits and star-studded appearances. But Solange wanted to limit how much even her own sister appeared on the album. Knowles explained, "I just thought that if she wrote too much, then maybe people would compare us. But definitely someone who has written 7 #1 singles is going to have a couple of songs on my album." Knowles' debut reached number 23 on Billboard's top R&B and hip-hop albums chart, and has sold over 100,000 copies in the United States according to Nielsen SoundScan up until this point. This was considered a lukewarm reception at the time by pop superstar efforts and standards, but what critics failed to realize that this wasn't the path that Solange was embarking on. That was the path that people were trying to force on her. Critics even went as far to say that her unconventional and experimental way of approaching music was a direct response to the Beyonce effect. And at the time, I can understand that, especially when there wasn't a blueprint that existed that could fit the archetype Solange was at the time. Knowles had to create that world for herself and let others follow on their own time. In an article with Billboard, Solange talked about this accusation and stated, "There's always going to be a bit of mystery as to how 2 people who grew up in the same household have different interests." Knowles adds, "I'm younger than her, and even in 5 years, there's a total gap in how you're exposed to musical things and fashion and art." A blogger Hipster Runoff stated that Solange Knowles is a never-ending quest to find her own niche in the indie sphere.
When I was about 11 years old, someone said to me, "You've got to shoot for the moon. Even if you miss, you'll land amongst the stars." Well, I wasn't interested in either.
Contrary to popular belief, it wasn't the easiest journey for her. You might think that just because Solange is a Knowles, that you may question what she possibly could struggle with, and that she should have the red carpet rolled out for her. Well, not exactly. She actually went through a windy path, a path with a lot of resistance, pain, and growth. And on Solange's second album, Soul Angel and the Hadley St. Dreams, she deviated even further from the pop royalty blueprint critics expected of her, and she wanted to focus on a sound that was more emotionally driven. She wanted a more modern twist on combining hip-hop and R&B elements with blues and jazz. And Knowles wanted to write her own songs. This body of work was heavily influenced by Motown's 60s and 70s sound. And while it was ambitious in thought, it didn't pan as well in execution from a commercial standpoint.
Well, for me, it was really about celebrating the diversity of R&B. It's, again, such a deep, nuanced genre, and there's so many expressions of it.
The year was 2012, and Solange then made the decision to seek more creative freedom, and she made the shift from a major to an indie label. Knowles at this time was able to take all the risk her creative spirit yearned for, and she was able to demonstrate her vision fully on her EP, True. And this was her most authentic work up until that point, which was a display of a personal and introspective body of work that, in her own words, was therapy to explore her own truths. Knowles collaborated with Dev Hynes for this project, and they were able to tackle what Solange had aimed to do on previous major label projects, but with a more vibrant and boundaryless take on pop and R&B music. After this EP, critics started to understand more of the trail that Solange was blazing for herself. The Guardian named Solange as an alternative icon in embryo, and in 2012, that was pretty spot on for what came into fruition in the future. Knowles found a sweet spot with this project that would place her ahead of the curve instead of behind and in the shadows of her big sister. A futuristic and free-flowing approach to music in 2012 was leaps and bounds ahead of where anyone, especially critics, thought pop and R&B music should sound like. This is an example of the magic in her work and the fruits from the mission that she tethered herself to. But this life as a creative, and especially of Solange's stature, comes at a cost. And no matter how talented a person is, they aren't impervious to health issues, growing pains, and just the uncertainties of life in general. Wherever the wind blew Solange, I believe she adapted in the way that resilient artists do. I don't feel like she fought the tide and drowned. I feel like she was just redirected to new creative and life terrains. Solange would continue to educate herself about the history of her people and how race was examined from the lens of Black people and the trauma that came from being subjected to inequality, and she began to unpack a deep sense of rage that existed in her.
This past year has been one of the most rewarding and wonderful moments of my life. I was able to turn my pain and my trauma and my rage into work and into my art.
Knowles read on the book Citizen, an American Lyric by Claudia Rankine, a review of our country's mistreatment of Black Americans and all of the microaggressions that were a direct reaction to the acts of terror that Black Americans experience. Knowles said, "This shows that we're not crazy and we're not tripping, and it's not our imagination. These things are very real. They are very painful and they are everywhere." Solange would internalize these messages and it would impact her art. Not in a negative way, but it was very positive. Solange became empowered to tell her story in a more in-your-face and unfiltered way. She wanted to emphasize that a conversation needed to be had with her audience, whether they were ready for it or not, cueing the importance of her next album, A Seat at the Table. Solange's third studio album, A Seat at the Table, was a 3-year process from the inception to completion, according to her interview with her sister. This album was celebrated for its fresh take on R&B that focused on live instrumentation and introspective writing. It was a piece that Solange wrote entirely by herself, and she also had a strong hand in co-producing the record. Solange says, "When I started to work on the sonics for this record, I realized that I had to create such a very specific sonic landscape in telling the story. I had these jam sessions, and there were holes that no one else could really fill for me. It really came out of a need for something outside of what I could articulate and lead someone else to do, and it was scary. A lot of times I was frustrated with myself and feeling insecure because it was new to operate in that space." Knowles also added, "For me, it was about asking, how can I exist with all this rage and all this pain and all this anger?" And Knowles wanted to transform this pain into stories and into an insightful body of work that let the audience in on a story about her lineage and their unique experiences. Knowles explained in an interview with her sister that the end result of this process was very rewarding, but she had to go through an uncomfortable writing process and an uncomfortable filming process and an even more uncomfortable process of releasing this music out into the world. Knowles says, "A lot of my projects are asking questions." She continues, "With this last piece, I had so many questions about what performance could be and how it could be in service to me." And Knowles found the perfect introduction image to this body of work. The first image you see when you're about to start this listening experience is a still image of Solange. And the image to me evokes a certain sense of emotion, which is a balance of reverent beauty, stillness, and stoicism. I felt that she was staring at me, like she was omnipresent in a way in that moment. Knowles gave insight into why she chose this specific cover and what she intended to get across, saying, "I wanted to create an image that invited people to have an up-and-close personal experience, for people to understand it's not going to be pretty and it might get a little intense, but it's a conversation we need to have." And Knowles definitely struck gold with this album, and what came out of it was an important record that touched the spirit of many. That record was Cranes in the Sky. The journey Solange had to go through to bring her vision together for Cranes in the Sky was a very tumultuous but enlightening experience. Along with her filming crew and her husband, Along with her filming crew and her husband, Solange traveled to the mountains, crossed over waterfalls, and as exhaustion began to creep in, they pushed past their breaking point because they were committed to executing the ideas that they had. The fact Solange and company were driven by a purpose kept them focused on accomplishing their goals even through the walls of fatigue and creative complications. Knowles says, "Cranes in the Sky is a song that I wrote 8 years ago. It's the only song on the album that I wrote independently of the record, and it was a really rough time. I was working through a lot of challenges at every angle of my life, and a lot of self-doubt, a lot of pity partying, and I think every woman in her 20s has been there, where it feels like no matter what you are doing, to fight through the thing that is holding you back, nothing can fill that void." Solange also added, "I remember looking up and seeing all these cranes in the sky. They were so heavy and such an eyesore, and not what I identified with peace and refuge. I remember thinking of it as an analogy for my transition. It was the symbolism of not addressing the root of the problem." Solange drives home, literally and figuratively, the importance of the visual component to storytelling and songwriting. This focus and attention to detail has permeated through all of her projects, and in my opinion, has elevated the experience of her projects, adding much needed depth with a touch of sensitivity and care that is rarely seen in the rollouts of most modern music. The importance of visual storytelling to Solange. It's really a meditation for me when I'm coming up with these concepts and painting these pictures. That is one of the few times that my brain shuts off in that way. And Knowles' husband at the time was there to support her from an encouragement standpoint and also a technical expertise perspective. Knowles had an artistic performance art approach to how she wanted to roll out this listening experience for the people that deeply connected with the album, A Seat at the Table. So she decided to take the opportunity to be minimal and modern in the architectural design, and she hosted the event with other Black performers. Knowles says she wanted to create the practice of having the space and time with herself and get to know her body better. Solange also added, "As a writer, sometimes when you're building up these sonic landscapes and you're building up this instrumentation, lyrics seem to get lost. I wrote every single lyric on this album with so much intention that it was important for me to be able to read and process it." We understand that Solange is very proactive in her career and her vision, and she understands that a lot of things will not be accomplished if she doesn't prioritize being extremely involved in the process. But she also understands the value of a team, which I spoke to earlier in this commentary video. And speaking of a team, she would later build a team to help her execute her vision in her creative agency, St. Heron, but she ultimately spearheads how she wants to move creatively through her life transitions. When Solange Knowles launched St. Heron in 2013, her vision was simple: to create a music and cultural hub amplifying Black artists. Quote Casey Afanyai. Knowles says, "Our vision is to build a space that engages radical conceptual imaginings across all facets and mediums of creation." Solange also added, "We feel an urgency in building and preserving collections and archives of our own artist stories and works and having a voice in what we deem worthy of preservation." Knowles says, "There should be a place where true stories of our past and present are thoughtfully told in expansive detail without the interference of outside perceptions." Knowles says she sees part of her legacy as taking care of the work that she's doing, that people will be able to come directly to the source when they want to know her story.
I think the feeling for me is the sense of home and being able to express and create that sentiment of home wherever you are. I think growing up in Houston and coming back to Houston, I was able to find groundedness in sort of all of the things that I might have thought were, you know, mundane or that I didn't pay attention to.
Critics and their opinions and thoughts and perceptions have been a recurring theme of this story and really in Solange's journey, and trying to identify Solange in the way that they want to and not accepting her for what she is. And she had to take that. She had to be very proactive in creating that space for herself. And I do like along the lyric book, and also she detailed in this interview, she highlighted, "Do not bite the hand that feeds you." And she wanted the listeners and the readers to focus on that because it's a very integral part of this story. And kind of this opinion that critics feel like the artists need them. And I feel like critics at times overvalue their words, and they have this hubris and ego when it comes to covering certain artists. And I feel like sometimes they feel their words take precedence even over the artist and their listening experience. When I feel like it's an economy, I feel like we should respect each other. When I go into cover artists like Solange, I want to cover the entire story, and I want to cover the great and the bad and the challenges and the triumphs and the successes, and allow for people to come to their own conclusions. I don't want to force anybody to come to their conclusions about any artist, but I do understand first and foremost that the art is the priority.
My journey has been a rise and fall. It's been ugly, it's been loud, it's been disruptive, it's been long, it's often been painful, but it's been free, it's been beautiful, and it's been mine.